Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another live session at the Reactors. My name is Rav and I'm the Program Manager here at Reactor London. Before we get into this session, please take a moment to read our code of conduct. We're all here to learn, so please be respectful of other people's views, understanding of differences, and please be kind and considerate in the way you engage. The chat will be open throughout and we do encourage you all to participate. We're back with another episode of 10 Tuesdays to Azure Fundamentals. Today, we'll be talking about the core Azure building blocks. If you haven't managed to catch up with the other two episodes, I will put the playlist in the chat so you can catch up on the previous two episodes. Please note that this is the third episode of the series, and we have a total of 10 episodes in the series. So this series will be continuing until March, and all the sessions will be recorded. So you can always go back and catch up. And with that, I'm now going to get Johan back on the stream. Hi, Johan.
Hello. Hi,
there's a little bit of a background noise.
Really?
I think it was all fine. Yeah, it was just a slight background noise, but I think it's all fine now. If you say something.
I can say something.
Yeah, okay, it's fine now, I think. I hope everyone can hear Johan perfectly. I'm gonna.
Okay. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna and just unmute again, see if that maybe makes a difference.
Yeah, that's fine now.
Okay, perfect. Well, good stuff. So good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. I'm not sure, 100% sure where everyone is, but welcome to day number 3 or the third sort of session of our 10 Tuesdays to Azure Fundamentals, whereby we'll be covering some content that will essentially help you and assist you to essentially get the certification for Azure Fundamentals, right? Our fundamental certifications don't expire, so it's once you've got this certification, that certification will continue. Unlike our ARB courses, like our administrator course and developer course, that you kind of need to renew every year or every sort of 2 years. It depends on what you've done. I want to just thank the folks again, Rav from the Microsoft Reactor, for making all of this happen. Everything you kind of see, except for the technical stuff I'm delivering, is kind of put together by Rav. She's driving the whole thing behind the scenes. So just thanks a lot for everyone for doing that. And you'll notice here at the bottom, I've got we've got the learning paths for the course. So you'll see if you go to arco.ms/az900lm, that'll take you to the overall and overarching learning modules for the Azure Fundamentals. You'll notice that we're actually going through them one by one. And then the second link at the bottom there, AZ900 EP3LM, is essentially the core building blocks that we are covering today. So welcome and good afternoon. My name is Johan Meiberg. I've been with Microsoft now for almost for like 4 years, pushing on 5 hopefully. I live just outside of London. I'm pretty passionate about community work and sharing knowledge and duplicating myself actually. But I'm originally from South Africa, and I live here in the UK now for about just over a year actually. Pretty also passionate about anything related to water sports. Kloofing in South Africa, it's like canyoneering. I stay very close to the Epping Forest here, so I love mountain biking. Getting like sort of mud all over the show. And of course, I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer, and I've put my personal email address, my Microsoft email address in there for you. I've put my Twitter handle on there, and I've also got my LinkedIn profile, right? If you go to arco.ms/Johan, that'll take you to my LinkedIn profile. Very happy to connect with you. Very happy for you to let me know on LinkedIn as well if you've passed the certification eventually after we've gone through the content. So just a brief overview of what we'll be talking about today. We'll be covering the building blocks of Azure. And this is essentially a very high level sort of overview of some of the core components that make up Azure, right? What's important about this is essentially going to give you some scale with regards to your deployments, right? What you don't want is you don't want all your eggs in a single basket. And that's really what today is about, right? Creating some structure and some room for growth that will essentially allow you to start deploying resources and grow your footprint in the cloud without, putting everything into a single area, if that makes sense. So we'll cover geographies, we'll cover regions, we will cover regional pairs. We're going to take an overall look at the hierarchy, or the taxonomy, if you want to call it that. Where we've got management groups, subscriptions, and resource groups. And then towards the bottom there, you'll notice we'll also chat and start touching on different resources, even though that'll probably start next week, where we'll start dealing with the individual resources. So for now, I'm going to start, and I'm going to look away from the camera for a bit because I'm going to be drawing, and I hope you can see this here. So I will, before we start talking about structure, I want to maybe just give you an analogy, right? So we're all on the same page here. I want you to think of structures of software that you might have worked with before. I'm thinking of something like Excel, right? Excel has generally got something like a workbook, which is the actual Excel file. And inside the Excel workbook, you might find one or more sheets. And inside those sheets, you might find columns and individual rows, right? So there's a structure there. If you're new to Excel, you might find yourself very very eager to start dumping lots of data inside Excel, because it's great, right? You can start drawing graphs and stuff like that. But as you start maturing using Excel and your use of the tool, you start realizing, but it's not always a good idea to put all my data in a single file, right? What if I want to share some of that data with someone? I have to now email them or share my entire document with them, which means that they can see everything. So then you start realizing, hang on for a second, there's a certain time and place for putting stuff in a single document. Certainly there's another time and place where you might want to split your data across multiple Excel documents and multiple sheets, right? So a very similar type of thing, and this is going to be what I'm going to be drawing now. If I was, for example, creating a file share for my organization, and our organization is a large organization, we've got some salespeople, we've got some IT folks, we've got some operations, we've got marketing. And if I was to create a file share for them, I would also have to start with some sort of a structure. So I'm just going to give you this as an example, right? So there you can see, I'm going to start with the root, and this might be, the root of a drive, right? So this might be, for example, the E drive, right? On Windows, just as an example. And then underneath this, I'm going to start creating some folder structures, right? So let's say, for argument's sake, if you're thinking of something like sales, just as an example, the sales folks might want their content and their documents stored separately from, for example, marketing, right? Who in turn want their documents to be stored separately from the IT department, right? And I can carry on like this. And I can think of, for example, the operations team, right, that might want to store their content and documents in a separate folder. But if I take sales, for example, right, sales might want their documents spread across a couple of additional folders, right? So some subfolders there. So under sales, you might find things like quotes. You might find things like invoices, right? And I'm going to dot this out, because actually, if you're in sales, you're probably going to come up with 7 or 8 different folders of typical documents that you end up working with that you might want to, place in folders. What you don't want to do is you don't want all the folders, and I'm going to give the folders like a green color here. You don't want all the files, rather, to be under the sales folder, right? First of all, you have to have unique names for the files. So if there's one file called quote.pdf, I cannot have another file called quote.pdf, right? So then having even additional subfolders under quotes might actually be quite viable, right? And very often this structure tends to grow quite a bit, and you might use something like permissions to sort of allow users not to create folders and give them a structure to work with. Almost any type of software that you work with on the planet has got a structure like this, or a taxonomy, right? It's a hierarchical structure that gives you room to grow, right? And Azure is no different, right? I can think, for example, of tools like SharePoint. There's a structure there. I can think of something like Exchange, right? Microsoft Exchange. There's a structure there, right? If I think of something like SQL Server, there's a structure. There's, the instance, the databases. In the databases, there's tables, just as an example. So Azure is no different, and Azure has also got some building blocks so that when you eventually get to deploy your resources can live in the structure and you can get some scale. This is quite important, though, because the structure that I'm referring to inside of Azure is also where you will apply permissions, right? So if you don't want to give granular permissions right at the bottom level by giving individual access to individual resources, you want to give access at a higher level so that the permissions kind of inherit down, right? And that's why the structure is so important. Now, you can probably start with something small, but it's important to understand what building blocks you got available so that in time you can actually grow this. Now, before we actually get into these building blocks, I thought it might be worth just kind of almost recapping of something that we spoke about already. Right now, if you notice, what I've got here is I've got the Azure Regions, right? This is a map of the Azure Regions. This is actually quite old. I got this from our website probably around 2 years ago for our administrator course. So there might be a lot more blue dots at this point in time, right? What I want you to notice is that very often these things are actually quite close together, right? If I think, for example, of South Africa, you should see that those two look like they are close together. Those two look like they are close together, right? These two. So it almost looks like what we are doing is we are pairing them together. And that's exactly what we are doing, right? Those two will probably be paired, and those two will probably be paired. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, you'll notice that the poor folks in New Zealand don't have their own, region yet. So they've got like a breakout type point to connect, and they fly their post pigeons there from New Zealand to Australia, right, where there are some data centers and some regions. I'm really just being, kidding now. I believe that there's already some action there in New Zealand. The reason why this is actually important is because I want you to notice that this is something you cannot choose, right? You cannot choose the regional pair. This is something that Microsoft decides. So what we make sure is that the regional pairing for region A is a certain distance away from the other region, so that if there's a natural disaster in one area, that the natural disaster might not affect both regions, right? So we try to do our planning to the point that we can understand that if one of the regions is affected somehow, that the regional pair will still be up and running and will still be running some of your workloads and store some of your data, right? So that is the idea behind these regional pairs. If you take a look at South Africa, we've got essentially South Africa North, right? This is South Africa North. And on the bottom left side here, this is essentially South Africa West, right? South Africa North is Johannesburg. South Africa West is essentially Cape Town, all right? And these two regions are regional pairs, which means certain resources that get deployed in South Africa West will have the data replicated to South Africa North. Certain services that get deployed in South Africa North will have the data replicated to South Africa West. So in that case, if South Africa North actually, goes down, or there's some sort of an outage, there's some sort of a natural disaster that renders the South Africa North region, inaccessible, your workloads and data might still be available in the regional pair. Right. So the first thing to remember is regional pairs, and you don't have control over this. This is something that we decide. And regional pairs, in other words, then gives you some sort of a redundancy between the different regions, right? So there's there's redundancy in that once the one region goes down, your workloads and data might still be available in another region. Not all of our services make use of this. Some of our services make use of this, not all of them, right? It's often also quite configurable. Let's take another. Let's drill down on one of these regions, right? I'm going to drill down in South Africa North, for example, right, or any of these regions to be fair. Our regions consist of more than just a data center. In fact, our regions consist typically of up to 3 data centers, right? And what I mean by that is, even though they might be sharing the same premises, we've got ranging from 1 to 3 different zones inside of our regions. And what this implies is that a region consists of more than one data center, which means that we've actually got some redundancy inside the region as well, right? So in other words, if I'm storing data, like let's say for example, I'm storing some blob storage files, right, in zone 1, and I select that the redundancy for that is going to replicate the content to zone 2 as well. If this entire data center goes down, my content is still accessible in zone 2. So regional pairs give you some regional dependency outside of the regions. Zones is what gives us some redundancy within a region, right? And you've got, again, you don't have, certain resources will prompt you for the zone, certain resources will not prompt you for the zone, right? It just depends what you are deploying. Now, we tend to also deploy this sort of piecemeal, right? If we announce a new region, there's a really good chance that the region will start with only having one zone. So we bring up one data center, and all the services that are available and only require one zone becomes available. And as the region grows, we start adding a zone 2, and all the resources that require more than one zone, 2 zones in this case, then start becoming available in that region. And then last but not least, when zone 3 becomes available, all the resources that we are planning for that region, not necessarily all services, but all the resources and services that we are planning for that region will become available. And and that's essentially what the regions looks like inside of one of those premises. It might be that these zones share the same premises. It might be that they're actually at separate premises. The key thing here is that each of these zones is completely separately managed and runs completely separately. There's no dependency between these zones. So, for example, the power that powers zone 1 will be different from the power and separate from the power that powers zone 2, will be different and separate from the power that powers zone 3, right? So you've got complete independence inside of the region. And you can, for example, create a virtual machine in zone 1, create another virtual machine in zone 2, create another virtual machine in zone 3, and you get that redundancy based on that. Right, so I don't want to go into too much detail here. It's just important to understand that this is at a high level what this essentially looks like. Okay, so if I can just summarize your Azure architecture at a high level, your physical architecture, we actually have something that even sits on above regions called a geography. And a geography, we've essentially split, the globe into 5 different geographies. There's the Americas, there's Europe, there's there's Africa, Middle East, and then there's Asia Pacific, right? So we've created these different geographies, and then we've got the different regions inside of those geographies. Each of these regions has got a regional pair. Some of the, most of the regions have got all the regions have between 1 and 3 zones inside the region for redundancy purposes. Now, you would have noticed on the previous slide here that I specified at the top there that we will always ask you for this. So when you provision a resource inside of Azure, like a virtual machine or a web app or something like that, or storage account, we will prompt you for the region. We want to know in what region you want to be placed, right? There's maybe some data residency issues there that you need to be aware of. Maybe your organization needs to ensure that all your data is stored within a single sort of country. So then it's up to you to ensure that you select the right region, right? And we will always ask you for the region. The thing we might ask you for is we might ask you for the zone. Depending on the type of resource you are deploying, we might not always prompt you for a zone. Certain services don't make use of zones, right? And certain services don't prompt you for zones because Microsoft is kind of managing the zones in the background, right? So in certain cases, you might be prompted for a zone. In certain cases, you will not be prompted for a zone. So it really just depends on the type of resource that you are deploying. All right, so that's important, and this is something that will get tested in the exam as well. You know, your geography, which consists of a bunch of regions. Each region has got a regional pair, and each region consists of up to 3 different zones. I hope that makes sense. Let's take a step back from the physical architecture for a minute, and let's talk about the logical architecture. Now the logical architecture is something slightly different, right? And once again, when you provision a resource, we might ask you for some of these things, right? Now, and this really comes down to the structure that I spoke about, and this is the reason why I drew this sort of file share here, right? Is so that you can see there's a hierarchical structure. We've got something very, very similar, in Azure. And it's essentially 3 different components, right? The first component is management groups. The second component is subscriptions. And the third component is resource groups. Resource groups is where the resources live. So if I provision something like a web app, a virtual network, a virtual machine, I have to place it inside a resource group, right? A resource group is really just like a type of placeholder, right? Resource groups live inside subscriptions. Subscriptions can, and this is optional, live inside of management groups, right? So management groups is the highest level in the structure and can actually be nested, right? And I'll demonstrate this for you in a couple of minutes. So let me just, and don't worry about, the tenant and the account and access here for now. All of that is largely irrelevant. Suffice to say that when you create your first Azure subscription, we will actually go and create the root management group, and your first subscription will be right in the root of that management group, right? It's up to you then to optionally go and create additional management groups for some structure. Management groups of these 3 components are also the only option that can be nested, right? So if I take a look at the next slide here, you'll notice that I can, for example, go and nest my management groups, I can nest them up to 6 levels deep. So I can go and create an expansive structure, right, using management groups, and I can strategically place my subscriptions around in that. There's always a root management group. These things are completely optional. And you'll probably find, if you're not aware of this, that certain customers might actually end up with 5 or 6 different subscriptions right there in the root, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but there is some structure that you can play with there, right? And over time, as your footprint grows in the Azure space, you want to create that scale, right? And you want to create that room for growth, very similar to the file share we spoke about earlier on. So a couple of things about management groups. Management groups are optional, as I mentioned. Management groups allows you to manage multiple subscriptions, right? So I can, for example, give you permissions at a certain level in the structure, and your permissions will inherit into, all the subscriptions in that structure and into all the resource groups underneath that. It is a hierarchical structure, nested up to 6 levels, and hierarchical structure implies that there's a parent-child type relationship, right? So this structure is probably quite sort of straightforward here, but if I had to expand on this, I can actually go and create some additional structure under IT, for example, and under operations, I might, have 2 IT might have some additional structures, right? So I can go and create some structure and some levels up to 6 levels deep under that root management group. Right, let's demo this for a second. I'm going to quickly mosey off here to my Azure subscription. Let me just bump the font slightly. And there you can see there's management groups. I can get to this by simply in the portal typing manage anything really. And you'll see that management groups will be one of the things that actually comes up there. So I'm going to select management groups. And there you can see some sort of a structure, right? If I minimize everything, there's my tenant root group. It's just actually a joke in my family. We try to always, change letters around in words. It drives us crazy. But there you can see there's my root group. And if I expand that, then you'll see that I've got an IT management group, I've got an operations, and I've got a sales management group. But at this point in time, the only one that's actually got subscriptions is the root. There's an always on subscription underneath that. You can see that that key is essentially, the icon for a subscription. And then you'll see that under IT, if I expand that, there's one called Dev, and there's another subscription called Training, right? So there's that structure. I've got my root. I've got one subscription in that root, and I've got, the IT, the operations, and sales. And if I wanted to, I can actually go and move this training subscription or move this dev subscription of mine. I can go and move it into, for example, into sales, just as an example. You hit the save button, and you should see within a few seconds, if I hit the refresh button, there you can see that my dev subscription now falls under that. And I'm also going to do the same here, and I'm going to move my always on into the operations management group, just so you can see that I can move them around. And there you can see now each of these has essentially got some structure underneath it. Okay, management groups, and that kind of brings me to the next component here, which essentially is subscriptions. Now, subscriptions is really the first thing that you create when you start using Azure, right? You might decide today we're going to start using Azure in your organization, and what's going to happen is you're going to navigate to the Azure environment, and you're going to sign up for a subscription. It might take your corporate your credit card, something like that. You might sign up for a free subscription initially. It might be that you get subscriptions assigned through your enterprise agreement with Microsoft. That's also an option. However, a subscription is essentially a contract between you and Microsoft on how you are planning to pay for certain resources, right? So I'm going to put this in yellow, so it's the color of gold. So this is essentially what you are paying for, right? If I put 5 virtual machines in subscription A, then subscription A will carry the cost for those 5 virtual machines. Now I can have multiple subscriptions. In fact, I might have one subscription for dev, one subscription for UAT, one subscription for production. And I might have that under sales, under IT and ops, right? So I might end up with 9 different subscriptions for that matter. Subscriptions, on the other hand, cannot be nested. So subscriptions, unlike management groups, I cannot have a subscription inside of a subscription. It's simply a one layer in the structure component, right? So, and this is typically also where you will set some thresholds and limits, like budgets, for example, to specify that, for example, our test subscription does not go over a certain amount, and you start getting emails at some point in time to say, hey, you're heading to 80-90% of your limits and budgets that you've set. And then you can see in that slide on the right hand side, you'll notice that if I just make this red, you'll see that there I've got the IT management group. These are my management groups, right? Those there are the management groups. And then the IT management group has got that one subscription, and the sales management group has got those 2 subscriptions. There's also a subscription in the root, and ops doesn't have any subscriptions at this point in time, right? So management groups nested down to 6 levels, and subscriptions can then strategically be placed around that structure so that it actually makes sense. I'm going to quickly demo this as well. It's like 32 minutes past. I think we're going to be finished a little bit earlier than usual today. So now I can, of course, click on training here, and it takes me directly into the subscription. You'll see it's starting to build a little bit of a like a breadcrumb here at the top, right? There's management groups, and now I'm in the training subscription. However, nothing is stopping me from typing the word sub here, and it will essentially also show me my subscriptions. In fact, if I type the word training here, then you will notice that the search inside the Azure portal is so accurate that it'll even bring me back resource names of what I'm searching for, right? So that's one way of getting to it. So if I go and search for subscriptions and click on that link, it'll essentially show me all 3 of those subscriptions. Now remember, each of these are in their own parent management group, as you can see there, and that is where that structure essentially lies. It's showing them to me in a list here, but there's actually that structure behind the scenes. All right, so you don't always see the structure, but it is there. All right, so let's crack one of these open. So you'll notice I've actually got a secure score, right? How secure does Azure think this subscription is? And I've got a secure score of 84%, 56, 58% on that option there. And of course, what you want is you want the most secure score, right? And there's various ways of doing that. We'll talk about that, in upcoming weeks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on my always on subscription. We're just going to minimize this section on the left hand side, and there you can see there's my subscription. And if I scroll down a little, you will see that there's some options like security, certain events. There's invoices, right? If I had some invoices and billing options. There's my payment methods. I don't think I'll have anything in there right now. This is not a standard type of subscription, but there you can see I can also add a payment method. I can pay by check or wire transfer. Not sure who pays by check anymore. And then you'll see there's also some partner information, right? And the partner information is essentially allowing me to say, but we're a big organization. We work with 5 or 6 different Microsoft partners. And if I type in the partner ID in here and validate the ID, then the partner will start getting some rebates, commission, if you like, based on my usage in here, right? And this is something that you tend to negotiate with your partner. Microsoft pays rebates to the partners that are essentially, building and managing solutions for our customers. I'm going to scroll down a little bit more here, and you'll see that there is something called resource groups, and I've currently got 4 resource groups in there. We'll talk about resource groups momentarily, but you'll notice that I've got 4 resource groups there, right? I'll get back to that in a couple of minutes. I'm going to just go through some additional options here. There you can see if I click on resources, it'll give me a list of all the resources I got, right? My pattern here is to call something always on if I have it always on, right? So certain resources that I provision during my training, and I clean up the resources afterwards. But certain resources, I've noticed that if I don't use them, there's not a big cost on them, so I just leave them there, right? Gives me some nice history and data to play with. So you'll notice that I've got some preview features here. Most important is, my usage and different quotas. And you'll notice if I click on usage, it's essentially going to, show me certain sort of, certain usage figures and numbers here. I'm not going to get into too much detail here, but you'll see that right now it's not showing too many items there because I don't really have a lot of resources that they're measuring at this point in time. In fact, there isn't anything there. Yeah, well, here we go. No, not a lot of them. In fact, if I go for, let's look for something like storage. And there should at least be a little bit more action. There you can see, there's some storage options there. We'll talk about policies later on. Something that is interesting is resource providers. So just from an overall governance and management perspective, I can go and specify which services are going to be registered and which not. So if I scroll down here, you will see certain services are not registered. This means that if I, for example, don't want my developers to work with Microsoft Digital Twins, right? Digital Twins is the ability for us to mimic something in real life with Azure, all those properties and things. So if I don't want folks to be using that in the subscription, I can go and unregister the service so that they cannot provision a digital twins instance, right? So you can use these resource providers to manage exactly what types of resources can be created and provisioned in each of these subscriptions. And then last but not least, I've also got something called deployments here. And you'll see from a deployments perspective, I've essentially got a Kubernetes cluster that I deployed at some point in time. Don't worry too much about that. There you can see I've got some properties, like for example, my address. Let me scroll past that quite quickly. And there you'll see, some additional information. The last thing I want to chat about here is essentially, if I, for example, go look at my costing, right? If I click on cost management, then our cost management tool will essentially allow me to do some cost analysis. And you'll notice here that I can actually go and specify in that structure the scope of which I want this to actually take a look at. So I can say select this management group, or I can go and drill down and I can select the always on subscription. And I can go and, it's not supported because it's a different type of subscription. None of my subscriptions will be supported like this. But either way, it'll then go on to show me, some information about what types of resources is using the most amount of information. I've also got some budgets. If I wanted to add budgets, you'll notice I can go and add a budget and say that this budget, has got, some sort of a name, and I can go and make it a monthly value of, what is that threshold. And Azure will then start sending emails to the administrators saying, hey, you've reached your 80% budget, right? So all of this kind of lives at subscription level or at a higher level at management group level. All right, so that is subscriptions. Basically, the contract that you've got with Microsoft on how you're planning to pay. Maybe you're going to pay and true up every 3 years. Maybe you're going to do something like a pay-as-you-go on a month-to-month basis. The last thing, and I want you to think about resource groups as those smallest branches on a tree, right? Because it's a hierarchical structure. So what we really have here is we've got like a tree. It's got the trunk of the tree, and then there's bigger branches, and then there's smaller branches, and still smaller branches, and eventually there's the leaves that grow on the branches, right? So resource groups are like the smallest types of branches that essentially allows you to create resources, and resources are attached to them, right? So your resources are like your leaves, if you take that analogy. So resource groups can also not be nested, right? So I cannot have a resource group inside of a resource group, but they tend to group together certain resources. Now, the approach you might take for resource groups might be as follows. You might say that we've got, bad idea. We're going to place all our virtual machines in a single resource group and all our web apps in a different resource group. That is probably not the best way of doing this. What I would suggest is something like look at the type of resources that you're going to be provisioning. If you are, and the different solutions that you want to group together. So, for example, if you are deploying something like SAP, which consists of maybe 2 web applications, maybe 3 virtual machines, and maybe some storage, I would recommend that you place those in a resource group, right? So group together the resources that are managed together so that you can give permissions at the resource group level, and those permissions can inherit into the resource group resources, right? What you want to avoid here is having a resource group with 1,000 virtual machines and having to give individual access to and micromanaging your access and permissions down at virtual machine level, right? You want to avoid that. So this is where your resources live eventually, and they are created in the region, but I don't necessarily have to place the resources in the same region that the resource group is in. You might be thinking, gosh, that's a bit weird. That's a bit strange. Why are we creating a resource group in a region, but I can place the resources in any region that are part of that resource group? Well, we really just need to understand, in what region, just as a placeholder. So we need to create, when we create the resource group, it's essentially going to prompt me for that, for the location. But as I said, it doesn't force you to place the resources in a specific subscription, in a specific region. So you'll notice here on the right-hand side, I've essentially got my management groups, which we spoke about at a very high level early on. I've got my one or more different subscriptions, and then under my subscriptions, I've got one or more resource groups. And this is essentially where things like my virtual machines and these sort of things are going to start hanging off those resource groups. Right, so that is the structure. I'm going to just quickly go back into the portal. I'm going to do a search here for resource groups. There we go, there's resource groups. And you can see from that I should have quite a couple of them. In actual fact, maybe I'm talking a bit fast. I'm going to hit the refresh button. It should not take so long. So there you can see I've got a good couple of them. I've got, I'm busy with the AZ400 this week. So there you can see some resources that I provisioned with the Azure pipeline. And there you can see there's a resource group for Cloud Shell. There's my always on resource group. There's a couple of resource groups that I use for specific domains, and so on. And if I click on always on, there you can see, there's all the resources inside of this resource group. And, there's a good couple of them. There's like a time series insights, there's a storage account, etc. And, I can even click on the resource visualizer and it'll actually show me a visualization of what the resources look like inside of this resource group. All right, so just to give you an example, if I'm going to go for something like virtual machines here, it's going to prompt me. I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to create a new Azure virtual machine quickly. A virtual machine is essentially an instance of an operating system. I'm going to place this inside my dev subscription. Take note here, it's busy prompting me for the subscription, right? So it wants to know, well, you're creating a virtual machine. How are you going to pay for this virtual machine? And I'm going to pay through this with my dev subscription, however I pay for that. It's prompting me here for a resource group. I'm going to create a new one, and I'm going to call this resource group structure, right? Structure RG, just so that I'm clear about that. I'm going to hit the OK button, and I'm going to give it a name, VM1, right? Very, very straightforward. It's Tuesday, and I've already started running out of ideas. You'll notice it's also prompting me for the region. I mentioned that I'll get prompted for the subscription. I'll get prompted for the region, right? So where do I want this thing to be placed? And I'm going to just go with UK South. That's the closest to me. And then it wants to know about certain availability options. Now take a look here. If I select availability zone from an availability perspective, I can go and select, the zones that I want it to be placed in. Right? Don't worry too much now about why I can select all three of them. But suffice to say, if I know that my one virtual machine lives in zone 2, I can bring up this virtual machine in zone 3 so that if zone 2 has some sort of issue, I will still be able to run my application on the virtual machine in zone 3, right? So it's up to you to plan and place your resources, in some cases, strategically across some of these zones. Right? I'm not going to select the zone there. I'm actually going to go for no infrastructure redundancy. And then you'll notice that I can go and select, something like Windows Data Center Server or whatever the case might be. And I can go with the username of Johan, and then I'm just going to punch in, a monster password here. Ooh. And I'm going to click on review and create. Got 15 minutes left here. And this should not take too long to provision. But what I want to show you is, if I want to show you that if I go for resource groups and I hit the refresh button here, maybe I must just refresh the entire browser and then hit refresh. There we go. There's my structure resource group that I created, right? It's inside the dev subscription, and you'll notice that all the resources required to run a virtual machine are slowly but surely starting to fill in here, right? And if I click on refresh now, I should also see there's my virtual machine. So there's some dependencies here. I cannot create the virtual machine if I don't have the disk. I cannot create the virtual machine if I don't have the network interface card. I cannot create the network interface card if I don't have the virtual network, right? So there you can see there's my virtual network. And so altogether at this point in time, there's sort of 6 different resources that all make up that one virtual machine, and they're all stored in that same resource group, right? And there you can see created the virtual machine, happy days, and there you can see I can go and manage this virtual machine. I can stop it, I can restart it, I can connect to it, for example, using RDP if I wanted to, and I can go and download that, and let's keep it, open up the file, and just drag this to the right section here. I'm going to go with more choices, and I'll use a different account name. The account is going to be Johan, and the password is going to be that. And there we go. My virtual machine is actually up and running. All right. So happy days, as I like to say. VM is up and running. My resources is deployed, and that structure is now, hosting these resources that I've actually gone and created. All right. So enough of that demo for now. This is just an overall sort of picture of what we spoke about. We spoke about the structure. We spoke about the management groups at the top, where we can nest those up to 6 levels deep. We spoke about subscriptions. That's only got one subscription in the layer. We spoke about resource groups that sit underneath the subscriptions. And then we also spoke about some resources that live inside of those resource groups. So it's important that you understand this, and that you don't end up creating all your resources in a single resource group over time. That's going to become a management nightmare at some point in time. Certain resources can be moved into other resource groups, but what happens when you do that is it essentially locks both of those resource groups. So if one of your virtual machines, for example, was compromised from a password perspective, you will, because it will be locked while you're moving it, you will not be able to reset the virtual machine password, right? So you want to avoid granular permissions, and you want to avoid, having to move resources around the whole time. And just to summarize, we spoke about these building blocks today in our third session. The building blocks are there for a reason. They give you some room for growth and for scale, right? You can imagine for an organization that has got 2,000 virtual machines that they are busy migrating into the Azure space. For them, they want to create some structure to create a very sort of consistent landing place for all their different workloads inside of Azure. And for that, they will typically use management groups, maybe different subscriptions, and resource groups for those resources eventually. And that is that. Are there any questions today? I hope that made sense for everyone.
Hi, Johan. Yes, we do have questions. I'm just going to go on from the top. I think
I'll quickly scroll through this as well.
So the first question's from Theo, and they ask, how many diverse communication routes are there to the regional pairs?
So I'm not 100% sure about the actual sort of numbers there, but we essentially make sure that the connections between these are highly available. So there will be at least 2 different network infrastructure routes between these two environments. I'm not actually 100% sure, but I know it's at least two. And I know it's at least two because if you go onto our global infrastructure, that you will actually see the cables there. There's two cables between South Africa West and South Africa North.
Next question from Sarah. Are zones physically far from each other? If yes, how many kilometers?
So no, Sarah, the regional pairs are a certain amount of miles away from one another. However, the zones can sometimes be on the same premises. Sometimes they're at separate premises, right? It just depends on where we've deployed and what the lay of the land and the geography looks like. So in some cases, they might share the same premises. In some cases, they might not even be close to one another. They might be a couple of miles away from one another or across the road or something like that. It depends. We don't have something consistent there. I hope that answers that question.
The next question from Harry. Where does account fit into the structure? It's listed separately.
Yeah, so that's a good point. I kind of hoped that I didn't have to chat about that, but I'm going to go back here. Let me just quickly take a look here. So when I create my first subscription in Azure, there's a couple of things that happens, right? In fact, if I create, and I really love this question because it's a good question and it's a very fair question. So if I was using something like Microsoft 365, right? SharePoint Online, all that stuff. If I was using something like Dynamics CRM 365, right? If I was using Azure, and I'm going to dot another one out here because it really doesn't matter which of our cloud services you choose. The first time you sign up for any of our services, what we will do is we will go and create an Azure AD, right? We will go and create an Azure Active Directory, and an Azure Active Directory is where your accounts get stored, right? So if I sign up and my name, my email, and my corporate email address is johan@contoso.com, we will go and check to see if there's already a contoso.onmicrosoft.com, and if there is already one, we will know that the Azure AD already exists. If there isn't one, we will go and create it, right? And that essentially forms the cornerstone of your tenant in a sense, right? So each of these subscriptions would have been created with an account, and that account has access to the subscription and can give other people access to the subscription or to the resource groups for that matter as well, right? So that's where the account comes into play. The account really sits under Azure AD, right? All your accounts sit under Azure AD. And we will talk about Azure AD probably next week or the week after that. I hope that answered the question.
And then I think we have one comment from Jeff. I've created a few subscriptions, but I've never seen management groups. Hopefully I can move subscriptions retroactively into a single management group.
Well, you can move them, but right now they will already be in a single management group, right? They will be in the root management group. So there's no point in moving them to a single other management group, right? If you've got multiple subscriptions, you want to use management groups to segregate the different subscriptions away from one another. So if you're just planning to always manage them together as 10 subscriptions, just leave them in the root management group. Unless, of course, you want to apply permissions to the different subscriptions separately. And for these 5 subscriptions, you want separate permissions, and for these 5 subscriptions, you want separate permissions. Then you might end up creating 2 management groups and placing these these 5 subscriptions each in each of these management groups, and that will essentially allow you to apply permissions and let those permissions inherit. I hope that makes sense. So yeah, you're 100% right. If you are not aware of management groups, it is not something that we are prompting you for, because we prompt you for the subscription, and inherently the subscription implies the management group, right? Because the subscription can only live in one management group at a time. It's a hierarchical structure, so it's like a taxonomy of sorts. I hope that answers my question, that question at least. I think I answered the question early on already.
We have a follow-up question from Harry. So account is for user account. I assumed it meant a cloud account for all use of Azure services, meaning account is owned by the org for billing and control. It looks like it's actually at the user level underneath a management group.
Correct. And an account will typically be something like a user account, right? So when we are not using any cloud resources from Microsoft at all, and I sign up for the first subscription in Azure or Microsoft 365 or whatever, then we will take a look at your email address and we will create your user account in that Azure AD. And then, we will allow you to start synchronizing the rest of your accounts from on-premises into the Azure AD environment. Harry, I hope that made sense. Otherwise, you're more than welcome to also just ping me on something like LinkedIn, and we can have the conversation further.
I think that's all the questions for today. Thanks, Johan, for another amazing session.
No worries. Thank you very much for the questions, everyone. Happy days. I hope that everyone learned a couple of things. And thank you very much. See you again next week, the same time.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. As Johan said, we'll see you again, same time, same day next week, 6 p.m. GMT for another episodes on 10 Tuesdays to Azure Fundamentals. Till then, take care and we'll see you next week.
Yeah, have a great evening.